This is a book review of Breaking the Social Media Prism, which I think is a really important book. It's really well researched. It puts out some really important ideas. So I'm going to go through and sort of explain what is the problem that he lays out, what are a couple of the key causes he identifies, and then what is his solution. And then I'm going to give some commentary on it, some things that I think could be extensions of the book or areas for new research. And then I have one critique of the book. So the bigger problem he's trying to address is polarization, political polarization. He is a political scientist, so that's his take on social media. However, early in the book, I think he identifies a more narrow place to focus on this problem, which is the fact that when you expose people to views from the other side on social media, that actually makes them more polarized. It moves people farther to the extremes of the side they started, left or right. So he discovered this through some of his own research, and in a lot of ways, the whole book is exploring what is going on with that, because that's not what people would have expected. There was a point in time when people were complaining about echo chambers and saying we need more exposure to the other side, and basically that's been debunked. Exposure to the other side does further polarize people, and people aren't so much in echo chambers. That's another thing he points out. So he really explores the question, why do we get this weird effect where exposure to the other side polarizes, and how can we stop that? So there's two big causes that I'm going to talk about from his book, and the first one I think really gets at the heart of what's going on social media. And this is the fact that social media basically provides a testing ground for us to test out new identities for ourselves and to see which of those new identities get positive feedback from others. And so we're essentially testing and experimenting with identities, developing our own identities, maintaining our identities. And of course, this is a very human thing to do. In fact, it's what we always do in social settings, is we sort of see what kinds of speech, what kinds of way of presenting myself, if I put them out there, will people respond well to? And then we develop those parts of ourselves more, present those more, and in that way we gain social status in our social circles. And he's basically making the argument that this natural human phenomenon has been moved online onto social media. And of course, the problem with that is that the environment online is going to shape what gets socially rewarded, which will then make us into the kinds of people that are socially rewarded on social media. And that tends to be polarizing figures. That tends to be people who slam the other side, who sort of view themselves as being super righteous because of their political beliefs. There's all kinds of negative things that are going to happen if we form our social identities primarily online. And you can think of this as when you're in a social group, you sort of conform to the social norms of that group. You become more like them through this feedback loop process. And you can think of, okay, what about a church group versus a sports team versus a classroom versus a politically active advocacy group? When you're in each of those groups, you're going to be testing out what do these people like about me, and you're going to do more of whatever they respond positively to. So developing those identities in those spaces, it takes time through this feedback loop. I think that is an absolutely brilliant point that he's bringing to the table having to do with social media. Now, the second cause that he identifies is the fact that social media is going to suppress middle-of-the-road voices and amplify more extreme voices. And that research demonstrates false polarization, which is where you view people from the other side as being more extreme than they actually are, and you view people from your side as being less extreme. And research has also borne out the fact that the people who post the most content on social media are the people farthest to the extremes. And his own research interviewing people found basically that moderates don't like to express their views on social media, only the people on the extremes do. And so why are the moderates not participating as much when those are the views that could depolarize us? If we see that there are people who understand both sides or people who have some views on the right and some views on the left, that could depolarize, but those people tend to stay quiet. And why do they stay quiet? Well, he actually identifies through some interviews that, for one, some of these people are harassed when they express views. They're harassed by people online, they're harassed by people in their own life, and that experience of that harassment will cause them to shut down, or at least to disengage politically on social media. He also finds, kind of unsurprisingly, that these moderates tend to be disgusted with sort of the tone and the uncivility of political conversation online. So they just don't even want to go there. And these moderates are also worried about ruining their in-person relationships by engaging online, so they don't. Now, he gives some solutions to this problem. I think the most important solution he presents is that we need to change the social feedback that's rewarded on social media. So currently, obviously, you're going to get more likes and more feedback if you are a polarizing figure, if you sort of lift up people on your own side and slam people on the other side. And so by socially rewarding that, we're going to get more of that bad behavior. So he proposes perhaps maybe we could socially reward people who have more diverse followers, or socially reward pieces of content that get positive feedback from both sides of the political spectrum. I think that's a fantastic solution, and if we're trying to develop a new, healthier version of social media, I think that's exactly where we need to go. Another part of his solution is to make people aware of how much they agree on. Because of course people do agree on a lot politically, and if we could focus on that stuff where both sides agree or where people in the middle might be more likely to agree, then we can actually make good political progress. And finally, he suggests promoting ideas before identities. So if people can identify less with their political side and more with the specific set of ideas, which might be different and might be combined more differently for people in the middle. So that's an overview of the book. Now, I would like to present 6 additions to his thinking that I think expand or build upon the ideas he's presenting here. I'm not going to call these critiques because it's a short book. I'm glad it's short. Maybe it can get out and more people can read it because it's short. But these are just things that I think need to be considered when considering the ideas he puts forward in the book. So the first is the role of contempt. Because I think if you think about what he's observing in the studies he does as being reactions to contempt, I think that actually makes more sense of the data he's looking at than some of the explanations he puts forward. I think the social feedback loop is brilliant, but that social feedback loop is not just about positive feedback. It's also in reaction to negative feedback or contemptuous feedback toward people like us. One of the projects in his own research that he undertakes is he starts to expose people to views from the other side, and that's where he found that people got more polarized by that exposure. And I think one of the best explanations for that is when you're exposed to the other side, you don't just hear their arguments. You also hear the contempt in their tone toward people like you. And when you experience contempt from another group toward people like you get really defensive. You're like, wait a second, people like us are way better than you. And it starts people down that polarizing road. So he didn't talk enough about contempt, and I think that is absolutely central to what he's seeing. And my definition of contempt is that it is an attitude of disgust that arises from long-standing negative thoughts about a group or person being morally inferior, intellectually inferior, or beneath consideration. And I think that's really tricky for researchers to think about because attitudes are hard to define, they're hard to measure. But in some ways, I think people are reacting more to the attitude than the ideas. My next addition to his ideas has to do with the fact that the algorithms, I believe, promote insecurity. And he actually acknowledges that there are studies on social media that show people who spend more time on social media, they compare themselves with people with greater social distance, with higher social status. So there is that impetus for insecurity on social media. He acknowledges that. And he also talks about self-esteem as one of the things that's driving this identity cycle. That you choose your identity based on what gives you self-esteem. That's something that he highlights in the book. But the thing that I think could be expanded upon is the fact that when you are building your identity to protect your self-esteem or to bolster your self-esteem, which he acknowledges, you're doing that oftentimes in response to feelings of insecurity. So it's not just that humans have this natural level of needing to build up our self-esteem through our identity. It's that when we're feeling insecure, we need a way of assuaging that insecurity. And therefore, we may put more effort into building up identities that will make us feel better about ourselves. So my hypothesis would be, if you look at people who don't spend much time on social media, my guess is they have less need to build self-esteem through identity building. And people who spend a lot of time on social media, for one, I think they're going to be more insecure for reasons that I would attribute to the algorithms. Now, I don't know if he would do that. But to fulfill that insecurity, the tool that social media gives them is this identity building tool, which is really a defensive, protective thing. Now, the next addition that I think could be made to his arguments in his book has to do with lurkers on social media. So obviously the feedback loop is going to be a big part of what's going on, but that feedback loop will only be completed for people who put out a lot of content on social media and are getting social feedback about that content. And there are a lot of lurkers. There are a lot of people who just simply observe but don't put out content and don't engage in the same way. And so I think researchers need to ask the question, what's the deal with those lurkers and what's the difference between them and the people who actually post? And my hypothesis here would be that it's some kind of vicarious status. That maybe some of the status feedback and status competition that's going on between these outlier polarizing figures, maybe some of that is giving the lurkers status in a vicarious way. It's sort of like, well, I'm not going to risk being rejected or harassed or whatnot by putting my own views out there, but I do have my own views. And so seeing someone who's advocating strongly for my views and seeing them put those other people in their place and seeing them sort of lifted up and them raise in status, maybe I get vicarious status through that. The fourth addition to his logic that I think we should consider is whether or not the online social feedback loop is displacing social feedback loops elsewhere. And my intuition here is telling me that yes, it's displacing real-world social feedback loops, or, and this is probably the more likely of the two, if people develop their identities mostly online, then the communities they seek out offline are going to be communities where that social status they've developed online works really well. Which means you want to seek out people who read similar content, have similar political views, have similar ways of bolstering self-esteem as people you interact with online, because that's where the feedback loop happens. In some ways, that's where you have a safe feedback loop. So when we're looking at these ideas he's laying out in the book, I think we need to think about what's the relationship between the social feedback loop online and the social feedback loop in face-to-face spaces. And then the last addition I have is actually pretty similar to the first point I made about contempt, but it's a little bit broader, which is it's not so much about information exchanged between people online, it's about attitude. It's about what kind of attitude are you conveying about my social status when I'm online, about how much you like people like me. What is your attitude about people like me like? And what is my attitude about people who are not like me like? And so it's not about the ideas, the policy ideas, it's about attitude. So I think we need to start developing some different measures for measuring contempt and measuring attitude. Because in some ways, it's really the meta conversation that I think is driving polarization. Now, I have one critique I'm going to share, and it's a pretty big critique. And that is, he takes the attitude that it's the people, not the technology, that's driving this. As a matter of fact, he even says, for now, machine learning does not seem to be a smoking gun. I think that is completely wrong. And the big problem I have with this is that I think what's going on is a feedback loop between the machine learning and the people's behavior. So I feel like a lot of people get this wrong by creating a false dichotomy between people's behavior and their choices online and the machine learning algorithms. People either think, oh, everything's driven by people's choices, and the thing that's wrong with the online space is people's choices. Or they think the thing that's wrong with online is the content that social media chooses to feed people, and they take away people's agency. I think both of those two things interacting is absolutely the cause of these problems. And you can't have one without the other. If you get rid of either of those two things, you get rid of some of these harmful behaviors we're seeing online. And of course, he doesn't spend a lot of the book talking about this. This comes up in a few pages of the book. But in those few pages, he basically says advertising doesn't influence consumer behavior. Well, if that claim is true, then advertisers need to know it because they're spending a lot of money on advertising. And so I thought that was a claim that needs a lot more research and a lot more background to establish that that were true. I tend to not think that's true. My guess is the industry of advertising would have figured it out by now if that were not true. Now, there are a couple of arguments in his favor on this very point that I'm criticizing. So one is, some people have made the argument that the biggest thing social media does is it reduces friction for things to spread virally. So if it's just human behavior driving this, but that human behavior gets spread more quickly, that would be an argument that what's going on is not the machine learning algorithms, it's the ease through which certain types of content that people react strongly to can spread through a population. That's the driver. I think there is absolutely a lot of truth in that. It's definitely not just the algorithms. I'm on board with that. The other thing in his favor is that behavioral economics has shown nudging does not always work as well as people think it does. And there's a variety of studies that have shown this. However, these studies tend to be one person intentionally nudging another person. And I don't think that's what's going on with social media. As a matter of fact, I think the way these algorithms are actually changing us is not through one-off pieces of content. I think these algorithms are slowly changing how we think over time through frequency of exposure, through hitting us at the right times when we're in the right moods. I think the way that these machine learning algorithms are actually operating is not the way we think they're operating. We tend to think, oh, it's this one piece of content that's actually changing people, and so the algorithms are just serving us more one-off pieces of content like that. I don't think that's what's going on. So my critique here is really a critique of the literature on this topic. I think the people studying whether or not machine learning is actually influencing people are not conceptualizing the way that influence happens correctly. So that's my biggest critique of the book. Overall, fantastic book. I think everyone should read it. We need more researchers thinking about these issues because they're definitely the issues of our time.